In 1951, a graduate student who had not yet finished his doctorate proved that a fair voting system cannot exist. Not that ours is flawed, not that we have not found the right one yet, that no such system can be built by anyone ever it was published. It was checked. It won him a Nobel Prize. And then, the part that actually matters, the part where the proof dissolves the phrase "the will of the people," was amputated from every retelling, and it never reached your classroom. Every democracy on earth still runs on a promise Kenneth Arrow showed cannot be kept, and nobody told you. Tonight, we follow it down. A French marquis who found the crack in 1785 died in a cell and was buried 2 centuries later in an empty coffin. A Cold War think tank asking whether the Soviet Union could be modelled as a single mind. 537 votes in Florida, where a candidate who could not win chose a president anyway. By the end, you will never hear a leader say the people have spoken the same way again, because an election does not measure the will of the people. It manufactures one. Get comfortable, settle in, and subscribe or join if you have not. The wider explorations, the physics, the deep history, the slow collapses, live over on the Patreon. Let's start where it started. In March of 2009, in Burlington, Vermont, a city of about 40,000 people held an election for mayor, and in that election, thousands of voters made a specific documented mistake. They voted for the candidate they wanted, and because they voted for the candidate they wanted, that candidate lost. If some of them had ranked him lower, if they had lied about their own preference and pushed their favourite down the ballot, he would have won. Their support is what defeated him, not their opposition, their support. I want to be precise about this, because it sounds like the kind of thing someone says to be provocative and then walks back. I am not going to walk it back. The city of Burlington used a system called instant runoff voting, sometimes sold to you as ranked choice, sometimes sold to you as the fix for everything wrong with ordinary elections. Voters ranked the candidates in order of preference. The math ran its rounds. And the winner of that election, a man named Bob Kiss, held his victory only because a block of voters who preferred a different candidate ranked Kiss too low. Raise Kiss on those ballots, move him up toward the top where his actual supporters wanted him, and Kiss loses the election. The act of expressing support for the winner would have removed the winner. This has a name in the literature. It is called a monotonicity failure, and it is not supposed to be able to happen in a system anyone would design on purpose. It happened anyway. In a real American city. In an election that decided who ran the place. And that is not even the part that should bother you. The part that should bother you is the other man. His name was Andy Montrol. And if you had taken the ballots from that election and asked one simple question, the question you probably assume every election is quietly answering, Montrol wins, and it is not close. The question is this. Take any 2 candidates, head to head, just the 2 of them, and ask which one more voters preferred. Do that for Montrol against the Republican, Kurt Wright, and Montrol wins, 56-44. Do it for Montrol against the incumbent Kiss, and Montrol wins again, 54-46. Montrol beat every other candidate in a direct one-on-one matchup. Every single one. There is a word for a candidate like that. He is called the Condorcet winner, and a lot of very serious people will tell you that a Condorcet winner is the closest thing that exists to the true will of an electorate. The candidate the majority actually prefers when you strip away the noise. Montrol was that candidate. The majority preferred him to everyone. He came in 3rd. The system eliminated him early, before the rounds that mattered, because not enough people had ranked him first. A majority wanted him over anyone else on the ballot, and the counting method threw him out before that majority could ever be expressed. Burlington repealed the system the next year, but the ballots do not lie, and they have been sitting in the public record ever since. And what they record is an election where the candidate the majority preferred lost to a candidate who only won because some of his own supporters were not enthusiastic enough to sink him. Now, you have probably heard some version of this before, and I know what the reflex is, because I had the same reflex. The reflex is to say, fine, instant runoff is a bad system, use a better one. First past the post gives you spoilers, so rank the candidates. Ranking gives you Burlington, so use something else. There is always a something else. There is always a smarter ballot, a clever accounting rule, a reform that a non-profit with a clean website is trying to get passed in your state right now, and the entire premise of that reform is that fairness is an engineering problem. Build the machine correctly, and the machine produces a fair result. Get the right people in the room, run the right math, and you can convert what a few million individual human beings want into a single decision that honestly represents them. That premise is false, not difficult, not unsolved. False. It was proven false in 1951 by a 29-year-old graduate student who had not even finished his doctorate, in a proof so clean and so total that it won him a Nobel Prize and has never once, in the better part of a century, been refuted, softened, or escaped. What he proved is not that our voting systems are bad. What he proved is that a fair voting system cannot exist, that there is no machine, no ballot, no counting rule, no reform, present or future, invented or uninvented, that can take the preferences of a group of people and turn them into a group decision while satisfying a handful of conditions so mild that you would be embarrassed to argue against any one of them. Pick your conditions for fairness. Make them as modest as you like. The proof says you cannot have all of them at once. You have to give one up. And the moment you see which ones you are forced to choose between, something opens underneath the whole idea of democracy that does not close again. His name was Kenneth Arrow. And the strangest thing about the theorem that bears his name, the thing I could not stop turning over once I found it, is where it came from. It did not come from a study of elections. It did not come from a love of democracy or a worry about it. It came out of a question somebody asked him at a Cold War military think tank in Santa Monica about whether the Soviet Union could be treated as a single rational mind, about whether an entire nation could be said to want things the way a person wants things, clearly enough that you could game out a nuclear exchange against it. The tool that quietly dissolves the idea of the will of the people was built to help the United States model the will of its enemy. I am going to come back to that, because it matters more than it sounds like it does right now, and because the irony of it runs to the very center of the whole story. But we cannot start there. We have to start earlier, with a French aristocrat who noticed something wrong with voting more than 200 years before Arrow proved it could never be fixed, and who died in a prison cell before anyone understood what he had found. Because the part that took me the longest to accept is the question this entire story is really about. We talk constantly about the will of the people. Every government on earth claims to carry it out. Every election is described as an expression of it. And almost nobody stops to ask the prior question, the one Arrow's theorem forces into the open. Not how do we measure the will of the people, whether there is a will of the people there to measure at all, whether that phrase points at something real, the way temperature points at something real, or whether it is a shape we see in the noise, an average we compute and then salute, a thing that feels obviously true until you look directly at it and find there was never anything there. That is the question. Hold on to it, because everything that follows is an attempt to answer it, and every attempt is going to fail, and each failure is going to make the question worse. Let me tell you about Condorcet. His full name was Marie-Jean Antoine Nicolas de Caritat, Marquis de Condorcet, and he was, by almost any measure, one of the best people the Enlightenment produced. Not the smartest, though he was close, but one of the best. He argued for the abolition of slavery when that was an unpopular thing to argue. He argued for giving women the vote in the 1780s, which put him roughly a century and a half ahead of most of the world. He was a mathematician of real ability, a protégé of the great D'Alembert, a friend of Voltaire, a man who genuinely believed that human reason, applied honestly to human problems, would carry the species upward towards something better. He believed, specifically and unfashionably, that you could apply mathematics to the moral and political sciences, that questions about how societies should choose were not just matters of rhetoric and power, but had structure, had answers, could be reasoned about with the same rigour as geometry. In 1785 he published the work that tried to prove it, an essay with a title that only a certain kind of mind could love, on the application of analysis to the probability of majority decisions. And buried inside that essay, almost as a technical aside, he found the crack. Here is the crack. I am going to walk through it slowly, because it is the seed of everything, and because it is one of those things that looks like a trick the first time you see it, and then never stops being true no matter how long you stare. Imagine 3 people deciding among 3 options. Call the people 1, 2, and 3. Call the options A, B, and C. Maybe they are 3 candidates. Maybe they are 3 policies, 3 restaurants, 3 anything. Each person has a clear, honest, completely reasonable ranking in their head. There is nothing confused or irrational about any of them. Person 1 ranks them A first, then B, then C. Person 2 ranks them B first, then C, then A. Person 3 ranks them C first, then A, then B. 3 people, 3 tidy preferences, no chaos anywhere. Now let us do the thing democracy does. Let us ask the group to decide, by majority, using pairwise votes, because majority rule is the one principle everybody in the room would agree is fair. Ask them, A or B? Person 1 prefers A. Person 3 prefers A, because remember, person 3 ranked C first, then A, then B. So between just A and B they take A, person 2 prefers B, that is 2 votes for A, 1 for B. The group prefers A to B clean majority. Now ask, B or C? Person 1 prefers B, since between those 2 they had B above C. Person 2 prefers B, person 3 prefers C. 2 votes for B, 1 for C. The group prefers B to C, another clean majority. The group prefers A to B, and the group prefers B to C. Every instinct you have, every rule of logic you have ever used, says the group must therefore prefer A to C. If I am taller than my brother, and my brother is taller than my sister, I am taller than my sister. This is called transitivity, and it is the thing that makes the word prefer mean anything at all. A to B, B to C, therefore A to C. It has to be. Ask them, A or C? Person 1 prefers A. Person 2 prefers C, since they rank C above A. Person 3 prefers C. 2 votes for C, 1 for A. The group prefers C to A. Read that again slowly. The group prefers A to B. The group prefers B to C. And the group prefers C to A. There is no winner. There is no best option. Every choice loses to something. If you pick A, a majority would rather have C. If you pick C, a majority would rather have B. If you pick B, a majority would rather have A. The majority, that clean, fair, unarguable principle, has eaten itself. It has produced a preference that goes in a circle. A beats B, beats C, beats A, forever, like water going down a drain that has no bottom. and nobody in the group was irrational. Nobody was confused. Every individual had a perfectly ordered mind. The incoherence was not in any of them. The incoherence appeared in the group out of nowhere, generated purely by the act of combining honest preferences with the fairest rule anyone knows. This is called the Condorcet paradox, and once you have seen it, you cannot unsee it. Because it belongs to majority rule itself rather than to any particular voting system. Instant runoff did not invent it, and first past the post did not invent it. It sits underneath every method that has ever tried to use majorities, which is to say underneath essentially all of them. Condorcet found it in 1785 and understood immediately that it was a problem, and he spent years trying to design his way around it, trying to build a rule that would find the true majority winner whenever one existed, and do something sensible when one did not. He never fully succeeded. Nobody has. 240 years later, the paradox he found is still there, and every serious person who works on voting theory has to make their peace with it. And the way most of them make their peace with it is by not mentioning it to you. What happened to Condorcet himself is the first appearance of a pattern that is going to repeat through this entire story until it stops feeling like coincidence and starts feeling like a law. He lived to see the French Revolution he had wanted, and then he watched it turn into something he could not follow. He was a moderate in a moment that was done with moderates. He served in the Legislative Assembly, he helped draft a constitution, and when the radical faction produced their own constitution instead, he made the mistake of criticizing it in print. A warrant went out for his arrest. He went into hiding in the house of a woman he barely knew, and while he was hiding, waiting to be caught. Knowing what was probably coming, he did something that tells you everything about who he was. He wrote a book about the future. Not a bitter book, a hopeful one. A sketch of the progress of the human mind, arguing that reason and science would keep pulling humanity forward across the centuries toward a world with less cruelty and less ignorance in it. A world he already knew he would not live to see. Then, in March of 1794, he left the house, was recognized, was arrested, and was thrown in a cell in a town whose name had just been changed to mean, roughly, equality. 2 days later, they found him dead on the floor. Nobody knows how he died. Poison he carried himself is the common guess. Murder is another. Exhaustion is another. When France finally honoured him, almost 200 years later, and moved his remains to the Pantheon among the greatest of the nation, they discovered his body had been lost so completely that there was nothing to move. The coffin they interred in 1989 was empty. The man who first proved that the collective will can dissolve into contradiction was buried symbolically, as an absence. I do not know how to describe that as anything other than the universe being on the nose about it. He was not the only one working on this, and here is where the pattern of forgetting starts. Condorcet had a rival, a naval officer and mathematician named Jean-Charles de Borda, who had proposed a different voting method a few years earlier, a method where you rank all the candidates and they earn points based on their position, so many points for a first place, fewer for a second, fewer still for a third. It is called the Borda count, and versions of it are still used today, and Condorcet's whole essay was in part an argument that Borda's method could get things wrong, that it could fail to elect a candidate who beat everyone else head to head. The two methods, Borda's points and Condorcet's pairwise majorities, disagree with each other in ways that cannot be reconciled, and the argument between them launched the entire mathematical study of voting. Here is the kind of disagreement Condorcet was pointing at, and it is worth seeing once, because it shows that the trouble is not confined to the circular paradox. Imagine an election with one candidate who is almost everyone's solid second choice, genuinely liked, offensive to no one, the compromise everybody could live with, and imagine two other candidates who each have a passionate base that ranks them first, and an equally passionate opposition that ranks them dead last. Run that election by Condorcet's method, by asking who beats whom head to head, and the mild compromise candidate can win cleanly, because in a direct matchup against either firebrand, the firebrand's haters plus the compromise candidate's own supporters form a majority. The consensus figure beats each rival one-on-one. He is the Condorcet winner, and there is a strong argument that he genuinely represents the group best, the person the most people can tolerate. But run the exact same ballots through Border's point system, where a first place is worth the most and a last place the least, and the compromise candidate can lose, because being everyone's second choice piles up middling points while contributing no first place enthusiasm, and one of the polarizing firebrands, with a stack of passionate first place finishes, can outscore him even though a majority of the room would have preferred the compromise candidate to that firebrand in a straight fight. Same voters, same honest preferences, two respected methods, two different winners, and no fact anywhere that tells you which winner is the real one, because the disagreement reflects no mistake by either method. The two methods are measuring genuinely different things and calling both of them the will of the group. The French Academy of Sciences actually adopted Border's method to elect its own members. Then, around the turn of the century, a new member arrived who did not care for it, insisted on his own approach, and got his way, because the new member was Napoleon Bonaparte. That is the literal history, and it happened exactly as it sounds. And then the whole thing was forgotten. For most of a century, the mathematics of how groups make choices simply fell out of view, the way things do, and the crack Condorcet had found was left sitting in old books nobody was reading. Until, in the 1870s, at Christ Church, Oxford, a mathematics tutor started thinking about how to run college elections fairly. He worked out the problem of cyclic majorities all over again, from scratch, apparently with no idea that a dead Frenchman had been there before him. He wrote 3 pamphlets about it, privately printed, one of them stamped with the words "not yet published." He gave the cycles their modern description. He designed his own careful system to try to handle them, and then his voting work, like Condorcet's, was forgotten for the better part of another century, rediscovered only much later by scholars going back through the archives. The tutor's name was Charles Dodson. You know him by the name he used for his other work, the work that made him immortal while his mathematics gathered dust. He called himself Lewis Carroll, the man who wrote about a world where the rules keep changing and nothing quite adds up, where a race can be run in circles and everyone declared a winner, spent his working hours on the discovery that group decisions really can run in circles with no winner at all. He just published the one and buried the other. And the burial was not an accident of a busy life. Dodson circulated his voting pamphlets among the people who ran his college, the men who actually had to hold elections and might have used a better method, and they did not take it up, and he did not push, and the work slid quietly out of view while the Alice books went around the world. The best mathematical mind to touch this problem in the 19th century produced a real advance on it, and then watched it evaporate, and the evaporation was so complete that when the political scientist Duncan Black went looking through the archives in the middle of the 20th century and found the pamphlets, he could barely believe that work of that quality had simply gone missing for 70 years. It had. That is what happens to this particular knowledge. It does not get refuted, it gets misplaced. That is 3 times now. Condorcet finds the crack and dies with it unresolved. Border finds a different angle and gets overruled by an emperor. Carroll finds the whole thing again independently and files it in a drawer. Discovery, oblivion, rediscovery, oblivion. It keeps happening, and it is worth asking why, because the answer is not that these were minor people or minor ideas. Condorcet was one of the towering minds of his century. Carroll's pamphlets contained genuine mathematical insight. The ideas kept vanishing not because they were weak, but because they were unwelcome, because what they showed was that the machinery everyone was relying on had a hole in the middle of it. And that is not the kind of finding a society built on majority rule goes out of its way to keep in view. The knowledge was real. It was published. And it kept getting quietly set down and walked away from, which is a thing you are going to want to remember, because in about 150 years it is going to happen to Kenneth Arrow's proof too, except that Arrow's proof is the one that cannot be walked away from, because Arrow did something Condorcet never managed to do. He stopped trying to fix the paradox, and he proved instead that it cannot be fixed. To understand how he did that, you have to go to Santa Monica, California, in the years right after the Second World War, to a place that was inventing the future of American power in a set of ordinary offices near the beach. It was called the Rand Corporation, a research outfit funded by the Air Force, and it had gathered under one roof a concentration of mathematical talent that is genuinely hard to believe existed in one building. These were the people thinking about the unthinkable, working out the logic of nuclear war, of deterrence, of what it would mean to fight or avoid a conflict that could end civilization in an afternoon. They used a tool that was new and glamorous at the time, game theory, the mathematics of rational players making strategic choices against each other. And to use it on the Cold War, they had to make an assumption. They had to treat the two sides, the United States and the Soviet Union, as players, as agents, as entities that had goals, that preferred some outcomes to others, that could be modelled as wanting things and acting to get them. Kenneth Arrow was a young consultant there, and he was in his 20s, and he had a background that made him exactly the wrong person to let that assumption slide. He had been born in New York City in 1921 into a Romanian Jewish family that had some money and then, in the Depression, abruptly did not. He had watched security evaporate as a child, which does something to how a person thinks about systems. He was ferociously, almost uncomfortably intelligent, the kind of student who exhausts his teachers, and he had come up through the City College of New York and then Columbia as a mathematician before the war pulled him into the Army Air Forces as a weather officer, where his first published research was about how to use the winds to fly more efficiently. He was, in other words, a man trained to ask what a model was actually claiming about the world before he trusted it. And when the strategists around him spoke of what the Soviet Union wanted, something in him refused to go along quietly. The moment it crystallized came out of a conversation. One of the Rand people, a philosopher named Olaf Helmer, was working on applying game theory to relations between nations, and he came to Arrow with a difficulty that was bothering him. The theory treated nations as rational players with preferences. But a nation is not a person. A nation is millions of people, each with their own preferences, often in flat contradiction with one another. What then does it actually mean to say that a country prefers one outcome to another? Where does a national preference come from, if not from combining the preferences of the citizens somehow? Could you even do that combining in a way that made sense? Helmer wanted to know whether the foundation he was building on was solid, and Arrow, who had been circling something like this question in his own doctoral work already, drawing on an idea from the economist Abram Bergson about something called a social welfare function, realized that he knew the answer, or that he could find it, and that the answer was going to be worse than Helmer feared. Because Arrow tried to build the thing. He tried to specify, cleanly and mathematically, what it would take to combine the preferences of many individuals into a single coherent preference for the group. A group that could be said to want things the way a rational person wants things, transitively without contradiction, the way the war planners needed the Soviet Union to want things. And instead of building it, he proved it could not be built. The tool the strategists needed, a rational collective preference derived fairly from individual ones, turned out to be impossible to build in a sense he could make mathematically exact. He was not trying to say something about democracy. He was trying to answer a technical question about whether you could model an enemy nation as a mind. But the proof does not care what you were trying to do with it. The proof applies to any group, any set of individuals, any attempt to turn their preferences into one preference. It applies to the Soviet Union. It applies to a committee. It applies to a family choosing a restaurant. And it applies, with full and total force, to an election. The instrument built to model the will of the enemy turned out to be a proof that the will of the people, our people, anyone's people, may not be the kind of thing that exists. Let me show you the proof, or at least the shape of it, because the beauty of it is that you do not need the mathematics to feel the trap close. Arrow did something that in retrospect looks obvious and at the time was radical. Instead of proposing a voting system and defending it, he wrote down the conditions any acceptable voting system would have to meet. Just the requirements, the minimum standards of fairness and sanity that you would demand of any method before you would agree to be governed by it. And he tried to make them as weak, as modest, as uncontroversial as he possibly could, because the weaker the conditions, the stronger the result. If you can show that even these barely there requirements cannot all be satisfied at once, then you have shown something crushing. Here is the first condition. It is called unrestricted domain, and all it says is that the voting system has to work no matter what people want. Whatever preferences the voters actually have, however they happen to rank the options, the system has to take those preferences as input and produce an answer. It cannot demand that people feel a certain way first. It cannot refuse to function just because the electorate turned out to disagree in an awkward pattern. A voting method that only works if voters conveniently avoid the Condorcet paradox is not a method so much as a standing bet on how the electorate happens to feel. Unrestricted domain says the system has to handle real people as they actually are. That seems not just reasonable, but mandatory. Here is the second condition, which is really just the demand that the output be coherent. The group's decision has to be an ordering, a genuine ranking, and in particular it has to be transitive. If the group prefers A to B and B to C, it has to prefer A to C. This is the condition that rules out the circular nightmare we found in Condorcet's 3 voters. It is asking only that when the group says it prefers things, the word prefer means what it means everywhere else, which is barely anything at all. Without this you do not have a decision at all, you have a whirlpool, and so we require it. Here is the third condition, and it is the one that sounds least like a condition and most like simple decency. It is called the Pareto condition, or unanimity, and it says that if every single person in the group prefers A to B, without exception, then the group prefers A to B. That is the whole thing. If literally everyone wants the first option over the second, the system is not allowed to output the second. Arrow himself could barely bring himself to treat this as an assumption worth stating, since denying it would mean building a system that overrules a unanimous public. If you and I and everyone we have ever met all prefer one thing, the group verdict should not come back as the other thing. Nobody is going to fight you on this one. Here is the fourth condition, and this is the subtle one, the one that does more damage than it looks like it should. It is called independence of irrelevant alternatives, and it says that the group's choice between any 2 options, A and B, should depend only on how people feel about A and B, not on how they feel about some third option, C. Whether the group ranks A above B should be settled entirely by the voters' opinions of A versus B, and should not flip just because some other candidate, some C who is not even in contention between them, enters the race or drops out or changes position. Think about why you would want this. Without it, you get spoilers. you get the situation where a third candidate who cannot possibly win still changes who does win by siphoning support in a way that flips the result between the two real contenders. Independence of irrelevant alternatives is the mathematical name for the demand that losers should not be kingmakers, that adding a hopeless option to the ballot should not reach in and change the outcome among the serious ones. That is exactly the property Burlington violated. It is exactly what people mean when they curse the spoiler effect. Arrow is asking only that the system be free of it. Reasonable, obviously reasonable. And here is the fifth and final condition, and it is the one that will make you laugh, because it is so low a bar that stating it out loud feels almost insulting. It is called non-dictatorship, and it says that there must be no single individual whose preferences simply become the group's preferences every time, regardless of what everyone else wants. No one person whose ballot is the only ballot that ever actually counts, whose ranking the system copies as the group's ranking, while everyone else's votes are decoration. That is all non-dictatorship rules out. One person deciding everything. Surely, of all the conditions, this is the one we can keep. Surely we are allowed to ask that democracy not secretly be a monarchy. 5 conditions. Unrestricted domain, so the system works for real people. Coherence, so the answer is not a whirlpool. Unanimity, so we do not overrule everyone. Independence, so losers are not kingmakers. And non-dictatorship, so no one person rules. Look at them, argue with them, try to find the one that is asking too much. You cannot. Each one on its own is close to undeniable. A reasonable person would sign off on every single one without hesitation, and would assume, as you probably assume right now, that of course some voting system somewhere can satisfy all 5, because why on earth would it not be able to? Arrow proved it cannot. He proved that for any group choosing among 3 or more options, no method of combining their ranked preferences can satisfy all 5 of those conditions at the same time. Not a bad method. Any method. Every method. If your system satisfies the first 4, if it works for all preferences and produces coherent orderings and respects unanimity and ignores irrelevant alternatives, then it has secretly, unavoidably, mathematically collapsed into the 5th failure. It has a dictator. Somewhere in the machinery there is a single individual whose preferences are silently determining the outcome, whether you designed it that way or not, whether you can see him or not. The only way to combine everyone's preferences into a coherent group preference, while respecting those obvious fairness conditions, is to quietly stop combining everyone's preferences and start copying one person's. That is the choice the mathematics leaves you. Give up coherence, or give up unanimity, or give up independence, or let the electorate be restricted to convenient opinions, or accept a dictator. There is no 6th door. He checked. That is what a proof is. It is the confirmation that there is no 6th door, that you have looked everywhere, that the thing you were hoping for is not hiding in some corner you have not searched yet. It is not there. It was never there. He published this in 1951 in a thin book called Social Choice and Individual Values, adapted from the doctoral dissertation he had not yet finished when he found it. He was a graduate student, and in 1972, when the Nobel Prize in Economics went to him, he was 51 years old, which made him the youngest person ever to receive it, a record that stood for decades. The prize citation spoke of his contributions to general economic equilibrium theory and welfare economics. The polite institutional language for, among other things, the man who proved that the foundational promise of democratic aggregation is a promise that cannot be kept. And there is something Arrow understood about his own result that almost everyone who cites it misses, the second warning of where this is all going. He did not think he had found a flaw in voting, He thought he had found something about combining preferences as such, wherever it happens. The exact same proof that dissolves the will of the people also dissolves if you let it. The idea that a market cleanly expresses the collective good, or that any aggregate of individual desires adds up to a coherent thing the group can be said to want. Arrow was not a critic of democracy. He believed in it, defended it, voted in it, and thought his theorem was a challenge to be worked with rather than a wall to despair against. But he was honest about what the mathematics said, and what it said was not that we have the wrong voting machine. What it said was that the object the machine is supposed to be measuring, the single coherent preference of the group, might not be there to measure. That there may be no fact of the matter about what a group wants, in the way there is a fact of the matter about what you want. That the will of the people might be, in the most literal sense, a category error, a phrase that behaves grammatically like it points at something real and does not. Before we go further, I have to correct something, because if I do not, the sharpest among you will catch it, and you will be right to. What I have described is not a proof that all voting is meaningless, and anyone who tells you Arrow proved democracy is a fraud is overselling it in a way that will not survive contact with someone who knows the material. Arrow's theorem is specifically about ranked systems, ordinal systems, methods where all the voter does is put the options in order. First, second, third, it is about preference orderings and nothing else. And that turns out to be the crack in Arrow's own wall, the one loophole in the impossibility, and we are going to have to deal with it honestly later, because it is the best hope anyone has of climbing out of this hole. But hold that thought, because the hope is smaller than it sounds, and because before we get to the escape route, the situation is about to get considerably worse. Arrow proved you cannot aggregate rankings fairly. Fine, you might say. Then let people be strategic about it. Let them vote cleverly, game the system, and maybe a smart electorate roots around the problem. Therefore, we have to talk about what happened in the 1970s, when two people working separately proved that this escape is closed too. The two people were Alan Gibbard, a philosopher, and Marquis de Condorcet, an economist, and they did not know they were working on the same thing. Gibbard published first in 1973 in the journal Econometrica, a paper with the flat, almost bureaucratic title on the manipulation of voting schemes. Satterthwaite reached the same result independently in his doctoral dissertation the same year and published it in 1975. The theorem they share is now called Gibbard-Satterthwaite, and it is Arrow's ugly younger sibling, the one nobody invites to the party. Here is what it says. Take any voting system for 3 or more candidates that is not a dictatorship, and that could, in principle, elect any of the candidates. Then that system is manipulable, meaning there will always exist situations in which some voter can get a result they prefer by lying, by submitting a ballot that does not reflect their true preferences, by voting strategically instead of honestly. Sit with what that means, because it is not the same as Arrow, and it is worse in a specific way. Arrow told you that you cannot combine honest rankings into a fair, coherent group ranking. Gibbard and Satterthwaite told you that you cannot even rely on the rankings being honest. In any system worth using, there are moments when your smartest move is to betray your own real preference, to rank a candidate you like below a candidate you like less, because doing so produces a better outcome for you than telling the truth would. The system, whatever system it is, punishes sincerity. And every method has this feature, all of them, without exception. The same universal, no escape, checked all the doors quality that Arrow had. If your voting system is not a dictatorship and can elect anyone, then somewhere inside it, honesty is a losing strategy, which means that every election you have ever participated in, under any system, was a game in which the truthful players were, at least sometimes, the suckers. You can watch it happen with almost nothing. Just 3 candidates and a simple plurality vote, the ordinary system where you pick one name and the most names wins. Say your sincere favourite is a candidate on the fringe, call her the outsider, and your second choice is a mainstream candidate you find acceptable, and your worst nightmare is the third candidate, the one you cannot stand. Now suppose you have a rough sense, as voters usually do, from polls and from the general mood, that the outsider you truly prefer has almost no chance, and that the real contest is between the acceptable mainstream candidate and the one you despise, and that it is close. What is your smartest move? It is not to vote for the outsider, the candidate you actually want most. If you do that, you have spent your vote on someone who cannot win and withheld it from the acceptable candidate who is locked in a tight race with the person you cannot stand, and you have made your nightmare more likely. Your smartest move is to lie. To vote for the mainstream candidate, you rank second, not first, because doing so is how you actually get the outcome you prefer over the outcome you fear. Every strategic voter who has ever held their nose and voted for the lesser evil has done exactly this, has performed the precise betrayal of sincerity that Gibbard and Satterthwaite proved is unavoidable, and has done it so instinctively that they did not even experience it as the deep structural flaw it is. They just called it being realistic. That instinct, that little swallowed act of dishonesty in the booth that hundreds of millions of people perform without a second thought, is a mathematical theorem expressing itself through your behaviour. You were not being cynical. You were being governed by a proof. And the interesting thing, the thing that should make you a little dizzy, is that this had been suspected long before it was proven. 2 thinkers, Michael Dummett and Robin Farquharson, had conjectured something like it back in 1961. The suspicion that voting rewards lying is old. The proof that it cannot be avoided is more recent, and it is total. That is 2 impossibility theorems now. Arrow, no fair aggregation. Gibbard and Satterthwaite, no honest one. And I want to correct something again here, the same way I did with Arrow, because the 2 results get blurred together constantly, even by people who should know better. And the difference between them is the difference between 2 separate wounds. Arrow is about the output. It says the group ranking you produce cannot be fair and coherent at once. Gibbard and Satterthwaite is about the input. It says the individual rankings you collect cannot be trusted to be sincere because the system gives people reasons to lie. One tells you the machine cannot combine the numbers fairly. The other tells you the numbers going into the machine are corrupted before they arrive. They are not the same theorem. They are 2 independent proofs that arrive at the same funeral from different directions, and the fact that there are 2 of them, closing 2 different doors, is the beginning of a pattern you are going to start seeing everywhere once I point it out. Because there are more than 2. There is Amartya Sen, who in 1970 published a paper barely 6 pages long with a title that sounds like a joke and is not, The Impossibility of a Parisian Liberal. Sen was after something different from Arrow, something that cuts even closer to the bone of what we think a good society owes people. He wanted to know whether you could combine, in one coherent social decision, 2 values that almost everyone holds simultaneously. The first is the Pareto principle again, unanimity. The idea that if everyone prefers one outcome, the group should too. The second is a minimal, almost apologetic notion of personal liberty. Not sweeping freedom, just the idea that over some tiny, purely private domain, each person gets to be decisive, whether you sleep on your back or your stomach, what colour you paint your own bedroom wall. Things that are nobody's business but yours, where your preference, and only your preference, should settle the matter. Sen asked whether a society could honour unanimity and honour even this shrunken minimal respect for individual autonomy at the same time. And he proved that in general it cannot, that the demands of collective efficiency and the demands of individual freedom, both of which we consider non-negotiable, come into direct mathematical contradiction. You can have the group's coherent preferences honoured, or you can have individuals be sovereign over their own private lives, but there are situations where you provably cannot have both, and the system has to break one of them. The way Sen showed it is small and sharp, and worth holding in your hand for a second. Picture two people and one controversial book and one copy of it, and a question about who, if anyone, should read it. One of the two is a fastidious sort who would rather the book not be read at all, but if somebody has to read it, would much rather it be him, so that at least it is not corrupting his more impressionable neighbour. The other cares nothing for the book himself, but is delighted by the idea of the fastidious one being forced to sit through it, because he finds that funny. Now grant each of them the tiny sphere of liberty that decency demands. The fastidious one gets to decide the purely personal question of whether he, and only he, reads it, and being who he is, he would prefer not to. The other gets to decide the purely personal question of whether he reads it, and being who he is, he too would prefer not to. Respecting each person's private choice over his own reading, then neither of them reads it, and the book goes unread. But now look at what both of them actually want, all things considered. The fastidious one prefers, above the outcome where nobody reads it, the outcome where he himself reads it rather than his neighbour, and the mischievous one prefers, above the outcome where nobody reads it, the outcome where the fastidious one is made to read it. Both of them, unanimously, rank the outcome where the fastidious one reads it above the outcome where nobody does. Unanimity says the group must too, but the private liberties we just granted delivered the outcome where nobody reads it. The demand that we respect each person's sovereignty over his own small domain, and the demand that we honour what everyone agrees on, have pointed in opposite directions at the same time, over a single copy of a single book, with only two people in the entire society. That is how little it takes. That is 3. There is more. There is a result by John Duggan and Thomas Schwartz that closed a loophole people had hoped would save them from Gibbard and Satterthwaite. Maybe, the hope went, you could dodge strategic voting by letting elections return sets of winners, ties, multiple outcomes, instead of forcing a single choice. Duggan and Schwartz proved that this does not help, that the manipulability follows you into the world of set-valued outcomes too. A mathematician named Alan Taylor later restated their result in a form I find genuinely unsettling in its plainness. He showed it comes down to this: a system that cannot be manipulated by an optimist and cannot be manipulated by a pessimist has a weak dictator sitting inside it, a single voter whose top choice is always somewhere in the winning set. The dictator keeps reappearing. You push him out of the aggregation and he shows up in the manipulation. You push him out of the manipulation and he shows up in the set-valued version. That is 4. There is even a version of this haunting the most boring topic in all of government: the question of how many seats each state gets in a legislature. It sounds like pure clerical arithmetic. Take the populations, divide up the seats proportionally, done. It is not done. Michelle Belinsky and Peyton Young proved that no method of apportioning seats can satisfy a few obviously desirable conditions at once. You want each state to get a number of seats close to its exact fair share, and you want to avoid absurd paradoxes, like a state losing a seat when the total number of seats goes up, or a state losing a seat to another state even though the first state's population grew faster. Belinsky and Young proved you cannot have all of that. every apportionment method must either sometimes give a state wildly more or fewer seats than its fair share, or must sometimes produce one of those paradoxes where adding seats takes one away from somebody. The United States has actually lived through this. Methods have been changed specifically because they produced results where growing the House cost a state a representative. There is no method that avoids every version of the absurdity. That is 5. 5 impossibility theorems. Arrow, no fair aggregation of preferences. Gibbard and Satterthwaite, no immunity to strategic lying. Sen, no reconciliation of unanimity with even minimal liberty. Duggan and Schwartz, no escape through sets and ties. Belinsky and Young, no fair division of the seats themselves. I am counting them out deliberately, because the accumulation is the argument. Any one of these you could dismiss as a technical curiosity, a clever edge case that clever people worry about and that does not touch real life. But that is not what this is. This is a wall of proofs built over decades by some of the sharpest minds in economics and mathematics and philosophy, several of them Nobel laureates, every one of them peer-reviewed and never overturned, all converging on a single conclusion from a dozen different angles. The conclusion is that fairness in collective choice was never an unsolved engineering problem waiting for a better engineer. The demands we place on it are mutually incompatible, and the incompatibility is provable, and it does not go away because you want it to, or because you have a nicer ballot design, or because your reform organization has a compelling founder with a good story. And here is where the abdication becomes impossible to ignore, where the thing that should genuinely make you angry lives. All of this is known, none of it is secret, it is not suppressed by any conspiracy, and I want to be careful never to claim that it is, because the truth is both less dramatic and more damning than a conspiracy. There is no cover-up. There does not need to be one. The results are sitting in the open, in the journals, in the graduate curricula, in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, where anyone can read them for free right now. The economists know, the political scientists know, the mathematicians know, and essentially none of it reaches you. It does not make it into the civics class where you were told that voting is how the people express their will. It does not make it into the earnest editorials about the sanctity of the ballot. It does not make it into the language every politician of every party uses. The will of the people, the mandate, the voters have spoken, as though the voters were a single entity with a single voice that the election simply transcribed. The people who understand that this language rests on a foundation that was proven hollow generations ago mostly just do not bring it up. Because what would they say? And to whom? And to what end? And it stays where it is, technically public and functionally hidden, a body of knowledge that contradicts the central self-understanding of every democracy on earth, and that everyone with the training to grasp it has quietly agreed to treat as an academic specialty rather than the news that it is. But maybe you are thinking, and it is the right thing to be thinking, maybe none of this actually bites in practice. Maybe these are worst-case theorems, proofs that fairness can fail without any promise that it usually does. Maybe the Condorcet paradox is like a coin landing on its edge, technically possible, vanishingly rare, and real electorates almost never fall into these traps. And so democracy hums along producing sensible results, and the impossibility theorems are just the fine print nobody needs to read. That is a serious objection. It is the objection the honest defenders of democracy actually make, and it has real force, and I am going to give it its full due, because a version of this story that ignored it would be propaganda, and you would be right to distrust it. But before I hand the defense its strongest weapons, I have to show you the theorem that takes this exact hope. The hope that the paradoxes are rare and harmless, and turns it inside out. Because in 1976, a political scientist named Richard McKelvey proved that when the choices get even slightly complicated, the paradox stops being a rare edge case and becomes the rule. It is everywhere, it fills the entire space, and it hands anyone who controls the order of the voting a power that should not exist in a democracy. Everything up to this point has assumed the simplest possible situation, choices lined up like beads on a string, candidates you can imagine sorting from left to right. McKelvey asked what happens when the choice is not one-dimensional. And almost nothing in real politics is one-dimensional. A budget has many independent knobs, taxes and spending and defence and welfare and 100 others, and different voters care about different combinations of them. A policy space, in the language of the field, has many dimensions, because there are many independent things to disagree about at once. And McKelvey proved that in 2 or more dimensions, the Condorcet paradox stops being a rare accident and becomes the overwhelming generic condition of majority rule, not the exception. The rule. In a multidimensional space, it is almost guaranteed that there is no Condorcet winner, no option that beats all others head to head. Instead, the cycles spread out and cover everything. From essentially any starting point, you can find a majority that prefers to move somewhere else, and from there, a majority that prefers to move again, and the chain of majority preferred moves can wander across the entire space of possibilities without ever settling. Now follow what that gives to anyone who gets to set the agenda, to decide the order in which options are voted on, because this is the part that should genuinely alarm you. McKelvey proved that if the cycles fill the space, then an agenda setter, a committee chair, a parliamentary leader, anyone who controls the sequence of pairwise votes, can steer the group from any outcome to any other outcome they choose. Any other outcome. Pick the result you want, however extreme. However far from where the group started, however much you suspect the group would hate it if you asked them directly. McKelvey showed you can get there. You construct a sequence of pairwise votes, this option against that one, the winner against the next, and so on, where every single step is decided by a genuine, legitimate majority, nobody cheating. Nobody voting against their sincere preference at any stage, and the sequence marches the group, one honest majority at a time, straight to the outcome you picked in advance. The chair does not need to rig any individual vote. Every vote is fair. The rigging is in the order. The power is not in the ballot. The power is in the agenda. And it is close to unlimited. And it is invisible. Because everyone participating can look at each step and see a clean majority and never realize they are being walked somewhere on a leash made of their own honest votes. You can feel the shape of it even in the tiny 3-way cycle we built with Condorcet, before we ever add a second dimension. Remember that the group there preferred A to B, and B to C, and C to A, going in a circle with no winner. Now imagine you are the chair of that group, and you happen to want option C to win, even though C is the option that loses to A in a head-to-head, even though there is a real sense in which the group likes C least of all in that particular matchup. Watch how easily you get it. You do not put C up first. You announce that the group will first decide between A and B, framing it as the natural place to start, and the group, voting sincerely, picks A, because a majority prefers A to B. Then you announce that the winner, A, will face C, and the group, voting sincerely again, picks C, because a majority prefers C to A. C wins. C is now the group's decision, arrived at through 2 perfectly fair majority votes, with no dishonesty anywhere. But if you had wanted A to win instead, you would simply have started the group with B against C, let B win that round, and then sent B up against A, where A prevails. Same group, same preferences, same fair votes, and you, the chair. Choosing the winner in advance, merely by choosing which pair goes first. The voters never see it. Each of them experiences only 2 honest votes that went the way the majority wanted. None of them experiences the fact that you decided the outcome before anyone voted at all. That is the whole mechanism, and McKelvey's terrible achievement was to prove that in a policy space of more than one dimension, this trick works almost always, to reach almost anywhere from almost any starting point. The rigged cycle is only the easiest place to see it. This is sometimes called the chaos theorem, and the name is earned, but I think chaos undersells it. Because chaos sounds random, and this is the opposite of random. This is total control masquerading as fairness. Remember Arrow's dictator, the one who kept vanishing and reappearing? The single individual whose preferences secretly determine the outcome. Here he is again, wearing his best disguise yet. In McKelvey's world, the dictator is not a voter at all. He is the person who decides what gets voted on and when. And because the multidimensional cycles guarantee that some path exists to anywhere, that person's control is as complete as any tyrant's, while the process around them stays flawlessly, provably democratic at every step. You wanted majority rule. You have it. Every decision along the way commanded a majority. And the destination was chosen for you before the first vote was cast, by someone who understood the geometry of the space you were all wandering in. The will of the people did not lead you there. The will of the people, it turns out, can be led anywhere at all, which is very close to saying it cannot lead anywhere on its own. Which is very close to saying it was never really steering to begin with. I need to stop and make sure the weight of this lands properly, because it is easy to hear all this as abstraction. Let me put it plainly, in the form of the question that has been running underneath this whole story. If a group's collective preference can be legitimately steered to literally any outcome depending only on the order you ask the questions, then in what sense does that group have a collective preference? A thing that can be moved to any location by an outside hand is a thing with no location of its own. If the will of the people is whatever the agenda setter decides to make it, on any given day, through procedures that are individually beyond reproach, then the will of the people is an artifact of the procedure rather than a fact about the people. Change the procedure, get a different will. Same people, same honest preferences, different order of questions, different result, all of them equally legitimate, none of them more truly the group's real desire than any other. That reveals something worse than a flaw in how we read the will of the people. There may be no fixed thing there to read at all. The phrase names an output rather than an object, and the output depends on the machine. I told you at the start to hold on to the question of whether the will of the people is real or a shape we see in noise. McKelvey is the moment the noise starts looking less like something we are failing to measure and more like all there ever was. But I promised you the objection, and now the story has to turn, because if it did not, I would be doing exactly what I have spent this whole time accusing the civics teachers of doing, telling you the half that serves my argument and skipping the half that complicates it. Here is the complication then, and it is real, and it is strong, and any honest person has to reckon with it. Democracy has not collapsed. That is not nothing. If Arrow and McKelvey and the rest had truly shown that collective choice is pure chaos, we would expect to see it. We would expect elections to produce visibly incoherent nonsense, governments to lurch at random, the paradoxes to erupt constantly in the daily life of every legislature. And that is not what we observe. Most elections produce a winner that most find at least intelligible. Most legislatures pass budgets that hang together. The catastrophe the theorems seem to promise does not, most of the time, actually arrive. And the reasons it does not arrive are the strongest counter-argument to everything I have just told you. And they deserve to be stated at full strength. The deepest of these reasons goes back to a Scottish economist named Duncan Black, working at almost exactly the same time as Arrow in the 1940s, who found the crucial escape hatch. Remember that Arrow's first condition was unrestricted domain, the demand that the system work no matter what people want, for every possible pattern of preferences. Black asked what happens if you relax that. What happens if the preferences are not arbitrary, but have a certain shape? Specifically, he looked at what he called single-peaked preferences. Imagine all the options really do line up along a single dimension, left to right, cheaper to more expensive, less to more. And imagine each voter has one ideal point on that line, one spot they like best. And the further an option sits from their ideal point in either direction, the less they like it. Their preference has a single peak at their favourite and slopes down on both sides. No weird double preferences, no liking the far left and the far right while hating the middle, just a single hill with the summit at what you want most. Black proves something beautiful and calming about this case. When preferences are single-peaked, the Condorcet paradox cannot happen. The cycles vanish. There is always a clean majority winner, and it is a specific, findable thing. It is the ideal point of the median voter, the person sitting exactly in the middle of the lineup, with as many voters to their left as to their right. That voter's favourite beats every option to the left because the median plus everyone to the right prefers it, and beats every option to the right because the median plus everyone to the left prefers it. The median voter's choice is the Condorcet winner, guaranteed, no paradox, no chaos, no agenda setter magic. This is the median voter theorem. And it is one of the most used ideas in all of political science, and it is the reason that a great deal of ordinary democratic politics is not chaos at all, but something quite orderly and predictable, parties converging toward the centre, elections that reward the candidate who captures the middle. When the world is one-dimensional, Arrow's nightmare simply does not occur, and Arrow himself knew it. And what makes this more than a mathematical curiosity is this. Real politics often is roughly one-dimensional. Two political scientists, Keith Paul and Howard Rosenthal, spent years building a system to measure this, feeding decades of legislative votes through a method that tries to find the hidden structure in how people vote. And what they found, across the entire history of the United States Congress, is that a single dimension, the familiar liberal to conservative axis, accounts for the overwhelming majority of how members actually vote. In a recent Congress, that one dimension explains about 93% of voting choices. Across all of American history, going back to 1789, it explains more than 80% of every recorded vote ever taken. Politics, for all its apparent complexity, keeps collapsing back onto a line, and a line is exactly the shape where Arrow's paradox cannot bite, and the median voter reigns. The multi-dimensional chaos McKelvey described is real in principle, but real electorates seem to spend most of their time in the one place where the chaos cannot reach them. The paradoxes are also, empirically, rare. People have gone looking. They have taken real ranked ballots and real preference surveys from actual elections and checked, directly, how often the Condorcet cycle actually shows up. And the answer, in study after study, is that it mostly does not. One recent analysis looked at more than 250 elections across nearly 60 countries and found no robust evidence of a single genuine cycle anywhere in the set. Not one that survived careful statistical testing. Earlier work was a little less clean, finding cycles in something like 1 election in 11. Still uncommon, still the exception rather than the rule. The coin can land on its edge. It just, in practice, almost never does. The defender of democracy has a real case to make. Yes, fairness is provably impossible in the worst case. But we do not live in the worst case. We live in a world where preferences cluster, where politics runs mostly along a single axis. where the median voter usually exists and usually wins, where the pathological cycles that the theorems permit almost never actually materialize. The impossibility is real and permanent, but its teeth rarely close on anything. And there is one more escape, the one I told you to hold on to much earlier, the crack in Arrow's own wall. His theorem is about ranked systems where all you do is order the candidates. It says nothing about systems where you express how much you like each candidate independently on a scale. Rate every candidate from 0 to 10. Or, simpler, just approve or disapprove of each one, checking off everybody you would be fine with. These are called cardinal systems, because they use magnitudes, intensities, not just orderings, and they carry more information than a mere ranking does, and because they carry more information, Arrow's theorem does not apply to them. They live outside its walls entirely. The impossibility Arrow proved is a property of trying to build a decision out of pure rankings and nothing else. Give the voters a way to say not just that they prefer this one, but how strongly, and the specific trap Arrow set no longer catches you. The most remarkable confirmation of this came from Arrow himself near the end of his life. In an interview in 2012, an interviewer from an election reform group walked him through exactly this point, that approval voting and score voting are cardinal systems and therefore fall outside his theorem. And Arrow agreed. He acknowledged that his framework had been built on rankings, that cardinal methods carry more information, and that this changes the game. Asked what he would actually recommend, this man, whose name is synonymous with the impossibility of fair voting, he did not throw up his hands. He said he leaned towards score systems, where you sort candidates into a few graded classes, and he thought plain approval voting was a little too coarse, but pointed in the right direction. The author of the impossibility theorem spent his final years gently suggesting that we had been asking the wrong question all along, that we had trapped ourselves inside rankings, and that a way out had been sitting there the whole time in the simple act of letting people say how much, not just which. He had, in effect, come to think that his own youthful dismissal of measuring intensity had been a mistake. Which brings me to the most important thing Arrow ever said about his own theorem, the sentence that should be printed under every breathless summary of it, including, if I am honest, some of the way I framed it earlier. He was asked, in essence, whether his theorem meant that democracy was hopeless. And he said no. He said, and I am giving you his own words as closely as they were recorded, that most systems are not going to work badly all of the time. That all he had proved is that all of them can work badly at times. Read that carefully, because it is a scalpel. He did not prove that democracy fails. He proved that democracy can fail, that no system is immune, that there is no safe harbour where the paradoxes can never reach you. But can fail is not the same as does fail. A bridge that can collapse under some specific rare load is not a bridge that is collapsing. Arrow closed his Nobel lecture by expressing the hope that people would take his result as a challenge rather than a discouraging barrier, and he lived that way, a man who had proven the impossibility of perfect fairness, and went on believing, working, and voting inside imperfect systems because imperfect was not the same as worthless. I have given the defense its full weight, and I meant every word of it because it is true and it is important, and a version of this story that left it out would be a lie of omission of exactly the kind I have been criticizing. Democracy works. It is not chaos. The paradoxes are rare, the median voter usually exists, cardinal systems offer a genuine way around Arrow's specific trap, and the man himself told us not to despair. If the question were only whether democratic government is a functional, decent way to run a society, the theorems would be a footnote and the defense would win and we could all go home. But that was never quite the question. Go back to what we are actually trying to find out. The thing I asked you to hold at the very beginning. Not whether democracy works, whether the will of the people is a real thing. And here is where the defense, for all its strength, quietly fails to save the one thing we most wanted saved. Because look closely at what the defense actually established. It did not show that there is a coherent collective preference sitting inside the electorate, waiting to be read correctly. It showed that under certain conditions, when preferences happen to be single-peaked, when the world happens to be one-dimensional, we get a definite answer out the other end. And that is a completely different claim. The median voter theorem does not tell you that the group has a real preference, and the median voter's choice reveals it. It tells you that if you restrict the electorate to a shape simple enough, the machine stops jamming and produces an output. The orderliness comes from the constraint we placed on them, the assumption that everyone's preferences fall neatly along one line. It was never a property of the people. We did not discover that the collective will is coherent. We discovered that if we only ever ask questions simple enough to have an answer, we will always get an answer. That is not the same as the answer being true. And the moment the world stops being one-dimensional, the moment there are two things to care about at once, the coherence evaporates and McKelvey's cycles flood back in, and the answer becomes whatever the agenda lets it become. The defense amounts to this. Democracy produces sensible results as long as the questions stay simple enough that a sensible result is mathematically forced. Widen the question, add a dimension, let the full complexity of what people actually want into the room. And the sensible result was never guaranteed to exist. We are not living in a world where the collective will is coherent. We are living in a world where we have gotten very good, mostly without realizing we are doing it, at only asking the collective the questions it is capable of answering, and calling the answers its will. The cardinal escape has the same shape of problem, and it is worth being precise about why. Because the enthusiasts for approval and score voting sometimes talk as though Arrow's theorem has simply been defeated and the whole difficulty dissolved. It has not. Arrow's specific trap is escaped, yes, but recall why Arrow restricted himself to rankings in the first place. He did it because he did not believe you could meaningfully compare the intensities of different people's preferences. When I rate a candidate an 8 out of 10, and you rate the same candidate a 4, there is no fact in the universe that tells us whether my 8 represents more actual enthusiasm than your 4, or less, or the same. My scale lives in my head, yours lives in yours. There is no shared unit, no way to lay them side by side and add them up, because feeling is not measured in a common currency, the way distance is measured in meters. Arrow banned intensity from his theorem precisely because letting it in requires you to pretend that one person's 10 and another person's 10 are the same size, and he did not think that pretense could be justified. Cardinal voting escapes his theorem by making exactly that pretense. It works by assuming that we can meaningfully add my intensity to your intensity, that your 10 and my 10 are the same, and nobody has ever shown that assumption to be true about human beings. We simply agree to treat it as true because it lets the machine run. That is a choice we make, and choices are not discoveries. And even setting that aside, cardinal systems do not escape Gibbard and Satterthwaite. They can still be manipulated. A voter who really loves one candidate but hates another has every incentive to give the beloved candidate the maximum and the hated one the minimum regardless of their true finer feelings, to exaggerate, to strategize, to distort their own report in the direction that helps their side. The honesty problem does not go away, it just changes shape. The cardinal escape buys you a way around Arrow's particular impossibility at the price of assuming something about human feeling that cannot be verified, and while leaving the manipulation problem fully intact. It is a real door, but it does not lead out of the building. It leads to a different room in the same building, and the building is the one where the will of the people still does not exist as a definite, discoverable fact, no matter which room you stand in. This is not despair, and I want to be careful that it does not curdle into despair, because the emotion here is something stranger and more precise than hopelessness. The feeling is the vertigo of watching a solid floor turn out to be a painting of a floor. The floor still holds your weight, most days. That is the defense, and the defense is right. But you can no longer unsee that it is a painting, and the question of what exactly you have been standing on all this time does not have a comforting answer. And to see how far from comforting it gets, I want to leave the mathematics for a moment and show you the two places where the edge of the coin actually landed on its edge, in the real world with real consequences, because the theorems stop being abstract very quickly when the rare case decides who runs a country. In November of the year 2000, the presidency of the United States came down to the state of Florida, and the state of Florida came down to a margin so thin it belongs in a story about the impossibility of measuring anything cleanly. When the counting finally stopped and the recounts were halted and the certification was signed, the official result gave George W. Bush and Al Gore each just short of 2,913,000 votes, and the gap between them, the gap that decided who would run the mightiest country on earth for the next 4 years, was 537 votes. 537 out of nearly 6 million cast. And standing off to the side of that impossibly thin margin was a third candidate, Ralph Nader, who had won 97,488 votes in Florida, and who had no chance whatsoever of becoming president, and who everyone knew had no chance, and whose presence on the ballot is the single most consequential real-world demonstration of Arrow's fourth condition that has ever occurred. Because Nader was, in the exact technical language of the theorem, an irrelevant alternative. He was a candidate who could not win, a third option that should, by any principle of fairness worth the name, have had no effect on the contest between the two who could. And he decided it. When people were asked afterward where Nader's voters would have gone had he not run, the answer was lopsided. Close to half said they would have voted for Gore. Only about a fifth said Bush. The rest would have stayed home. Run the arithmetic on even the most conservative version of that split, and Nader's presence cost Gore far, far more than 537 votes in Florida. Remove Nader from the ballot, change nothing else, not a single voter's actual opinion about Bush versus Gore, and Gore wins Florida and wins the presidency. The outcome of the 2000 election was not determined by whether Americans preferred Bush or Gore. Nationally, more of them preferred Gore, by more than 500,000 votes. The outcome was determined by the presence of a man who could not win, interacting with a voting system that Arrow proved cannot ignore him. What people call the spoiler effect is independence of irrelevant alternatives failing, in public, with the presidency as the stake, exactly as the mathematics said it someday would. And here is the part that ties it back to everything. The part that should make the whole edifice feel unstable under you. That same electorate. Those same Florida voters, with those same opinions, would have produced a different president under a different voting system. Under instant runoff, where Nader's voters would have had their second choices counted after he was eliminated, Gore almost certainly wins. Under approval voting, where people could have approved both Nader and Gore, Gore almost certainly wins. The ballots contained the information. The people's preferences were sitting right there. It was the machine, the specific rule for turning those preferences into a result, that selected Bush. Change the machine, keep the people, get a different leader of the free world. The will of Florida did not choose George W. Bush, first past the post did, out of the raw material of a divided electorate, and it could just as easily, from the identical raw material, have chosen otherwise. This is the concrete face of Arrow's theorem, and once you learn to see it, you find it everywhere, because every voting system is a set of choices about which of Arrow's conditions to sacrifice, and each sacrifice shows up as a specific, nameable pathology. First past the post, the system most of the English-speaking world uses, throws away independence of irrelevant alternatives completely, which is why it is a spoiler machine, why it punishes third parties, why it can hand power to a candidate that most of the electorate actively opposed as long as the opposition was split. Instant runoff rescues you from some of the simple spoiler cases, but it pays for that rescue by giving up monotonicity, which is the property Burlington violated, the property whose absence means that raising a candidate in your esteem can defeat him. The border count, where you assign points by rank, is generous and consensus-seeking, but it is trivially manipulable and it is savagely vulnerable to irrelevant alternatives, because adding a hopeless candidate can shift the point totals enough to change who wins. The Condorcet methods, the ones descended directly from the old Marquis, will faithfully elect the candidate who beats everyone head-to-head whenever such a candidate exists, but they have to have an answer for what to do when no such candidate exists, when the cycle appears, when A beats B beats C beats A, and every answer they give in that case is, in some way, arbitrary. There is no free lunch. There is no system that keeps all the properties you want. Each one is a different bargain with the same devil, a different choice about which piece of fairness to hand over in exchange for producing any answer at all. That whole list is Arrow's theorem printed in the ballots of every democracy on Earth, a set of bargains rather than a set of solutions. And you are simply never told that the choice of voting system is a choice about which kind of unfairness you are willing to live with, because it always is, because it mathematically must be. When a country picks a voting system, it is not choosing the fair one over the unfair ones, because there is no fair one. What it is choosing is which specific failure to expose itself to, which paradox it would rather risk, whose thumb it would rather have secretly on the scale. And most citizens, casting their votes with a completely reasonable faith that the system is a neutral instrument for reading their collective will, have no idea that the instrument was never neutral and never could be, that it was built, of necessity, with a bias baked into its foundations, and that the shape of that bias, more than their own opinions in the hard cases, is what decides the result when the result is close. The machine is not reading the will of the people. In the moments that matter most, the ones decided by 537 votes, the machine is writing it. The person who pushed this line of thinking as far as it can honestly go was an American political scientist named William Riker, and in 1982 he published a book about it with a title that states his conclusion before you open the cover. He called it Liberalism Against Populism, and its argument is that the entire body of work we have been walking through, Arrow and Condorcet and all their descendants, quietly demolishes one of the two great theories of what democracy is for. Riker drew a line between two visions. One he called populism, and it is almost certainly the vision you absorbed without ever being taught it explicitly, the water you have been swimming in. Populism says that there is such a thing as the will of the people, that this will is the proper source of law and legitimacy, and that the function of an election is to discover it and put it into effect. When a politician says the people have spoken, when a movement claims a mandate, when anyone speaks of the popular will as a thing that governments exist to carry out, they are speaking the language of populism in Riker's sense. And they are assuming that the will of the people is a real object that voting reveals. Riker argued that social choice theory kills this vision outright. If the outcome of an election depends on the voting system, and it does, and if the same electorate produces different winners under different fair procedures, and it does, and if the collective preference can be cyclic or steered or manufactured by the agenda, and it can, then the election is not revealing a pre-existing popular will, because there is no single pre-existing popular will there to reveal. The result is a joint product of the people's preferences and the machinery's contribution cannot be separated out and discarded. The claim that the people have spoken, that the outcome expresses their will, is, Riker said, empty, not wrong, exactly. Empty, it points at nothing. We do not know what the people want, he wrote, because the question does not have the kind of answer the populace needs it to have. And he went further, into genuinely dark territory, arguing that the populist illusion is not merely mistaken but dangerous, because a ruler who believes he embodies the will of the people has been handed a limitless justification for whatever he wants to do. The arrogance of power, dressed up as the voice of the nation. Populism, Riker thought, gives tyranny its favourite disguise. What he believed survived, the vision he thought could withstand the theorems, he called liberalism, in the old sense of the word, the Madisonian sense. This vision asks much less of voting. It does not ask elections to reveal a popular will. It asks them only to do one modest negative thing, to give the public the power to remove officials it has come to dislike. Not to express what the people positively want, which may be incoherent, but simply to throw the current rascals out and replace them with different ones, periodically, without bloodshed. On this view, the value of democracy is not that it discovers the collective good, but that it constrains power, that it makes rulers removable, that it gives the governed a lever they can pull to end a government they have soured on, whatever the tangled and possibly contradictory reasons each of them has for souring. That much, Riker argued, the theorems leave standing. The will of the people may be a fiction, but the ability of the people to fire their government is real, and it does not require the will of the people to be coherent. And it is perhaps enough, Riker admitted, with disarming honesty, that it had taken him something like 20 years of living with Arrow's discovery to give up the populism he had started his career believing. This is not a thing people surrender easily. He did not surrender it easily. Now I have to give you the honest counterweight to Riker, because Riker is the strong reading, and the strong reading has been contested by serious people, and even-handedness requires that you hear them. The most prominent challenge came from a political theorist named Jerry Mackey, who argued at book length that Riker had massively overstated his case. Mackey's argument leans on exactly the empirical point we saw earlier, that the pathologies are rare, that real electorates almost never actually produce the cycles, that the manipulations Riker catalogued are far less common in practice than his theory implied. If the paradoxes essentially never occur in real democratic life, Mackey argued, then the will of the people is not empty at all. Elections do carry meaningful, stable information about what people collectively prefer, most of the time. And the fact that they could theoretically fail too is no more damning than the fact that a well-built bridge could theoretically resonate itself apart in a freak wind. The possibility of failure in the abstract does not empty the concept of content in the concrete. This is a real argument, and it has real defenders, and the debate between the Riker view and the Mackey view is not settled, and I am not going to pretend to settle it for you, because the honest situation is that it is generally contested where exactly the mathematics stops biting and ordinary meaningful democracy begins. But notice what even the optimistic side is conceding, because this is the thing that does not wash out no matter which way the debate goes. Both sides now agree that the will of the people is not a simple, robust, always available fact. The optimist's position is not that the collective will straightforwardly exist and the election reads it. The optimist's position is that the conditions under which a coherent collective preference happens to exist are common enough in practice, that we can usually proceed as if it does. That is a much humbler claim than the one on the civics poster. It is the claim that the fiction is usually harmless, that we can mostly get away with it, that the flaw is a painting, but the painting is load-bearing almost all the time. Even the defense of the will of the people has quietly become a defense of a useful fiction rather than an assertion of a fact. And that is a strange and vertiginous place for the foundational idea of democratic legitimacy to have ended up, defended not as true, but as usually close enough to true that the difference rarely matters. Rarely, except in Florida, in the year 2000 when it mattered enormously, and the difference chose a president. I want to come back to the man now, because I promised him to you at the start, and because who he was matters to how you hold what he found. Kenneth Arrow was not a bitter man or a cynic, or someone with a grudge against democracy that he dressed up as mathematics. By every account of everyone who knew him, he was the opposite, warm, generous, almost impossibly kind, a person who lifted up younger scholars rather than crushing them, whose students, an astonishing number of them, went on to win Nobel Prizes of their own because he had a gift for making the people around him better. He came from a family that reads like a joke about improbable talent. His sister married an economist, and their son grew up to be Larry Summers, who would become Treasury Secretary and President of Harvard, and that economist had a brother, Paul Samuelson, who was himself one of the greatest economists of the century and a Nobel laureate, which meant that young Larry Summers grew up with two Nobel-winning uncles at the dinner table, Paul Samuelson on one side and Kenneth Arrow on the other, and Summers told a story years later of a party where the two of them talked mathematical economics deep into the night, while everyone else waited by the door to leave. When Arrow died, Summers called him a hero and a dear man, and the most important economic theorist of the second half of the 20th century. He married Selma Schweitzer in 1947, and they were together for 68 years, until she died in 2015. He died 2 years after her, at home in Palo Alto, in February of 2017, 95 years old, having spent a life inside democratic institutions he genuinely loved, teaching, writing, arguing, voting, believing in the enterprise of collective human reason, even though he, more than almost anyone who has ever lived, understood the exact mathematical sense in which its central promise cannot be kept. That is the irony I cannot get past, the one that feels like the physics of the thing reaching up into the life of the man. Here was a person of extraordinary warmth and decency, who trusted people, who built people up, who wanted the shared human project to work, and he is the one who proved, with a rigour that has never been broken, that the shared human will he wanted to serve may not be the kind of thing that exists. The gentlest man in the room wrote down the coldest result in the discipline, and then went on being gentle, went on participating, went on treating democracy as worth defending, precisely because he understood that its worth could not rest on the foundation everyone assumed it rested on. He did not despair. But he also never pretended the flaw was solid. He just kept walking on the painting carefully, with his eyes open, which may be the only honest way anyone can walk on it. And I keep returning to where it started, because the origin will not leave me alone. This did not begin with a love of elections. It began at a military think tank in the anxious early years of the Cold War with a question about the enemy. The strategists needed to treat the Soviet Union as a rational actor, a single mind with coherent goals, so they could model it, play games against it, reason about when it would strike and when it would hold back, with the survival of the species riding on getting the model right. And a young man was asked, in effect, whether that was even a coherent thing to do, whether a nation could be said to want things the way a person wants things. He went looking for the machinery that would let you build a national will out of the wills of millions of citizens, the machinery the war planners needed to exist. And he came back and reported that the machinery cannot be built. Not for the Soviet Union. Not for the United States. Not for any collection of human beings anywhere. The tool that was supposed to let us model the mind of the enemy turned out to be a proof that neither the enemy nor we ourselves possessed the kind of single mind the tool assumed. He set out to measure the will of the other side and discovered that there is no coherent will on any side to measure, ours included, and that the phrase we use most confidently, the will of the people, our people, the good guys, the ones the whole apparatus of the free world was built to serve, refers to something that may exist only as a shadow cast by the machine we use to look for it. Let me tell you what I think this actually means, now that we are at the bottom of it, and let me not soften it, because softening it would be the same betrayal I started by complaining about. We are taught, all of us, from the time we are small, that democracy works like a measurement. The people have preferences, the way an object has a temperature, and the election is the thermometer, and the number that comes out is a reading of something that was already there. Get a better thermometer, a fairer one, a more accurate one, and you get a truer reading of the public will. That is the picture. That is the picture on the poster in the classroom, in the language of every inauguration, in the reflex of your own mind when you hear that the people have spoken. And the entire body of work we have just walked through, from a dead marquise in a French cell to a graduate student at a Cold War think tank to 5 decades of theorems stacked one on top of another, is the discovery that the picture is wrong at the root. The election is not a thermometer. There is no temperature. The thing the thermometer is supposed to be reading does not exist independently of the thermometer. Different fair thermometers, applied to the identical public, return different readings, all equally valid, and there is no fact about the public that determines which reading is correct, because the reading was never a property of the public in the first place. It belongs to the instrument. What Burlington revealed, in the end, was not a broken election. It was an unusually honest one, an election that happened to show its work, that let you see the machinery producing an answer that the machinery itself had chosen. The functioning elections, the ones that feel clean, the ones that produce a winner nobody argues about, are not more truthful than Burlington. They are just quieter about the same fact. They produce an answer that happens to be robust, that most fair systems would have produced too, and so the machinery stays invisible and you get to believe you witnessed a measurement. But the machinery was there the whole time, in every election, making choices that the voters did not make and could not see, and on the rare close days when the machinery's choices become visible. We call it a controversy, a crisis, a broken system, and we reach for a reform, when what we are actually looking at is the ordinary hidden nature of the thing finally showing its face. And this is the point where the vertigo becomes total, so I am going to say the hardest part as plainly as I can. When a country of hundreds of millions of people holds an election, and a leader emerges and stands up and says that the people have chosen, that he carries their will, that his power flows from their collective desire, he is describing something that the mathematics says is not there, not hidden, not hard to measure, not there. There is no single collective desire for him to carry, no unified will that the vote uncovered, because a collection of millions of conflicting individual preferences does not add up to one coherent preference, and cannot be made to, and the proof that it cannot be made to has sat unrefuted for the better part of 100 years. What the election produced was a legitimate result, in the sense that a defensible procedure generated it. What the election did not produce, because it could not, is a discovery of what the people wanted, because the people, as a single wanting thing, do not exist. We built our whole civilization on the authority of a voice that has no throat. And yet, and this is the part I genuinely do not know how to sit with, the part that keeps me honest against my own argument. We cannot stop. We cannot do without the fiction, because there is no clearer truth waiting behind it to take its place. What waits behind it is force. A strong man who decides what the people want by decreeing it. The abandonment of the one negative power, Riker said, actually survives, the power to remove a government without killing anyone. The fiction of the popular may point at nothing, but it does real work. It gives the losers a reason to accept losing. It gives those in power a reason to fear those without it. It lets 100 million people who agree on almost nothing coordinate, peacefully, on who holds office next, which is a miracle even if the story we tell about why it works is false. We are left in the strangest possible position. We are running the most important machinery of human civilization on a concept that we can prove does not refer to anything real. And we cannot stop, and we should not stop, because stopping is worse. And the people who understand this most deeply are not the ones trying to tear democracy down. They are the ones like Arrow, who understood exactly how empty the foundation is and chose to keep building on it anyway, with their eyes open, because open eyes on an empty foundation is still better than the closed eyes that came before. I want to talk to you directly for a moment, because there is a feeling I suspect you have had, and I think you have been told it was naive, and I want to tell you that it was not naive at all. You are seeing something real. You have probably had the experience of watching an election result come in and feeling, underneath the official story of a clear outcome, a quiet wrongness. A sense that the number on the screen did not actually capture what the people around you wanted, that the result was somehow both legitimate and untrue at the same time, that if you had asked everyone slightly differently, you would have gotten a different answer, and no one could say which answer was real. You were probably encouraged to dismiss that feeling, to treat it as sour grapes if your side lost, or as overthinking if it won. Do not dismiss it. That feeling was you perceiving, without the vocabulary for it, the exact thing Arrow proved. You were not imagining the gap between the result and the reality. It is the gap the mathematics guarantees, the space between the answer the machine produced and the coherent public will that was never there to be produced. You felt the painted floor flecks under your foot, and you were told floors do not do that. They do. You were right. And once you have this vocabulary, you start to see how carefully the vocabulary has been kept from you. And that is the thing that moves past unsettling into something closer to anger. At least it did for me. Think about the pattern one more time all the way through. Condorcet finds the crack in 1785 and dies in a cell, and his body is lost so completely that his nation buries an empty box. Border builds a rival system and gets personally overruled by Napoleon. Lewis Carroll rediscovers the entire problem from scratch a century later and files it in a drawer marked not yet published, and it stays effectively unpublished for another 100 years. Arrow proves the whole thing impossible in 1951, wins the Nobel Prize for it, and the result becomes famous as a piece of technical economics while its actual meaning. The part where it dissolves the will of the people gets quietly amputated from every popular retelling. The knowledge keeps being found, it keeps being real, and it keeps not reaching the classroom, not reaching the poster, not reaching the language of the inauguration, not reaching you. Not because a committee met in a dark room and decided to hide it. That is not how the important things get buried. They get buried because they are uncomfortable, because they contradict the story a society needs to tell about itself to keep functioning, and because everyone with the training to understand them can feel, without being told, that repeating them too loudly is somehow not done, The suppression is a climate more than a conspiracy, and a climate does not need anyone to enforce it. It just needs everyone to quietly agree that certain weather is inconvenient, and to look away from it together, generation after generation, until the looking away becomes so natural that no one remembers there was ever anything to look at. I told you near the beginning that I could not stop thinking about where this came from, and now that you have the whole shape of it, I think you can feel why. The mightiest societies on earth organize themselves around a phrase, the will of the people. They fight wars in its name. They execute the losers of revolutions in its name, as they executed the people around Condorcet, as very nearly they executed him. They grant and revoke the legitimacy of governments based on whether those governments can plausibly claim to embody it. And a man went looking, at the request of people planning for the end of the world, for the machinery that would make that phrase mean something precise, and he found that the machinery cannot exist, that the phrase is a beautiful and load-bearing and possibly necessary fiction. That when we invoke the will of the people, we are invoking something with exactly as much independent reality as a constellation, a pattern we draw by connecting dots that are not actually near each other, that looks like a shape only because we are standing in a particular place and squinting in a particular way. The constellation is real enough to steer a ship by. It is not real enough to land on, and we have been trying to land on it for 250 years. And here is the last turn of the screw, the one that follows you out of the voting booth and into the rest of your life, because Arrow understood something about his own proof that almost everyone who cites it as a fact about elections manages to miss. The theorem is not about voting. Voting is just the cleanest example. The theorem is about aggregation itself, about the general act of taking many individual preferences and combining them into one collective preference. And that act is not something we do only on election day. We do it constantly. We do it every time we speak of what the market wants, as though the buying and selling of millions of people summed into a single coherent desire that prices are reading off. We do it every time we speak of public opinion as a thing with a shape, or consumer demand as a force with a direction, or the national mood, or what the country believes, or the greater good that policy is supposed to maximize. Every one of these is an aggregation of individual wants into a collective want, and every one of them inherits Arrow's void, because the proof does not care whether the preferences are being combined by ballots or by prices or by polls or by the vague averaging your own mind does when it imagines what the majority thinks. Wherever you sum up what individuals want into what a group wants, the same impossibility is sitting underneath, the same absence of a coherent collective thing to sum toward, which means the strangeness reaches well beyond politics. It is woven through the entire way we talk about living together. We are surrounded, at every level, by confident references to the desires of collectives that, if Arrow is right, do not have desires in any coherent sense. The economy does not want anything. The market has no preference. The public holds no single opinion. The country believes nothing, because a country is not the kind of thing that can believe, any more than it is the kind of thing that can want, and the appearance that it does is the same constellation trick playing out on 100 different canvases, our minds insisting on seeing a single wanting agent wherever there is a crowd of individual ones, because a single agent is something we know how to think about, and a crowd of contradictory ones is not. We are pattern completers. We see faces in clouds and wills in populations, and the will in the population is exactly as real as the face in the cloud, which is to say it is entirely a feature of the observer and not at all a feature of the thing observed. Arrow did not just take something away from democracy. He took something away from every sentence you have ever spoken that treated a group of people as though it were a person. And once that is gone, once you really absorb that the collective wanting thing was never there, the world starts to look different in a way that does not reverse. You cannot go back to hearing the phrase "the will of the people" the way you heard it before. The words keep their sound and lose their flaw. I do not have a resolution for you, and I am not going to manufacture one, because the honest situation is that there is not one. There is no solution waiting to be found here. This is a permanent feature of what happens when many minds try to become one. And it does not get better with a smarter ballot, or a wiser electorate, or a more enlightened age. Condorcet believed, in the cell where he waited to die, that human reason would carry us forever upward, that the application of mathematics to human affairs would light the way to a better world. He was right that the mathematics would arrive. He could not have known that when it finally arrived, in its full and rigorous form, the thing it would prove is that the destination he was walking toward, the coherent expression of the collective human will, is not a place, because it is not anywhere, because it is not. Think about the next time you vote, because you will and you should, and nothing I have said is an argument against it. Think about the walk to the polling place, the small quiet ceremony of it, the pen or the screen or the folded paper, the act that the whole civic religion of the modern world treats as sacred, the moment when you add your preference to everyone else's and the great machine takes all of it in and returns a verdict. You have been taught to understand that moment as participation in a measurement. As your contribution to a reading of the collective will, your voice joining millions of others to produce a number that means something, that captures what a people together has decided it wants. That is the meaning that gives the act its weight. That is why it feels like more than filling out a form. And it is the part that is not true. Your vote is real. Your preference is real. The count is real. The winner is real and will hold real power over your real life. But the collective will your vote is supposed to be helping to express is the one thing in that whole chain that has no reality of its own, the ghost the entire ceremony is built to summon, and it does not come, because it was never there to come. And the verdict that emerges is a genuine product of a genuine procedure that is nonetheless not the discovery of anything, because the thing it claims to discover does not exist to be discovered. Go back to Burlington one last time, to those voters in a small Vermont city in 2009, the ones who voted for the candidate they wanted, and, by wanting him, defeated him. There is a version of this story where they are the victims of a bad system, where a better system would have honoured their preference cleanly, and there is truth in that version, and it is the version that let the city repeal the method and move on and feel like the problem had been fixed. But there is a deeper version, and by now you can see it. Those voters were not the exception. They were the moment the rule became visible. Every electorate is doing what they did, always, in every election, expressing preferences that the machinery converts into an outcome, by a process that could have converted them into a different outcome, an outcome that belongs as much to the machine as to the people. Burlington is not the broken case that stands out from the working ones. Burlington is the working ones, caught in the one lighting where you can see the strings, and the candidate the majority actually preferred, the one who beat everyone head to head and finished third and went home, he is not a bug in the system. He is a photograph of the truth the system exists to keep out of frame, the truth that the majority preferring someone and the system selecting someone are two different things that we have spent centuries pretending are one. Kenneth Arrow spent 70 years living inside that pretense with his eyes fully open, and he never once suggested we abandon it. And I think that is the closest thing to wisdom this whole story contains. He knew the flaw was painted. He knew the will of the people was a constellation and not a star. He knew that the machinery writes as much as it reads, that no ballot can be fair, that honesty is a losing strategy, that the agenda setter is a hidden king, that every democracy on earth stands on a proof that its foundational promise cannot be kept. He knew all of it, more precisely than any human being has ever known it, and he still walked to the polling place, and still cast his vote, and still believed the imperfect, impossible, ungrounded enterprise was worth defending, because the alternative to an empty foundation is not a solid one. The alternative is no flaw at all, and a man deciding, alone, what the people want, and calling it their will, and no lever anyone can pull to remove him. That is where this leaves us. Not with an answer, with a way of standing. The people, you will be told, carried the will of the people to victory, did not carry it, because it was not there to carry. The mandate does not exist. The collective voice has no throat, and the vote you cast, precious and necessary and worth defending with your life, is not a measurement of anything, because the thing it claims to measure was invented by the same act that claims to read it. We built the most important machinery in human history to answer a question. A 29-year-old proved the question has no answer, and we kept the machinery running anyway, because we had nothing else, and because the running of it, empty as it is the only thing standing between us and the man who would tell us what we want. The will of the people was never real. You will keep voting as though it is. That is not a failure of nerve. It may be the bravest thing we do, and it does not make the ghost any more real, or the flaw any more solid, or the answer any more there. The Marquis died reaching for it. The graduate student proved it was not there. And tomorrow, somewhere, a leader will stand up and say the people have spoken, and mean it, and be believed, and be wrong, in the precise mathematical sense that has been sitting in the open, unrefuted, and unspeakable for the better part of 100 years.